Let's head on over to the Artesia Museum, and Michael Rebman, the director, is with us. Good morning, Michael.
Good morning.
Hadn't talked in a couple of weeks. I hope your time spent. You were getting an exhibit ready to go, and is that the clothing from the back in the day? That exhibit all good to go and ready for folks to come see?
Yes, the Fashionable Founding Fathers, menswear of 1905. It is open to the public and on display.
Excellent. So we'll talk more about that in a minute, but I know what you'd like to share with us is some historical perspective and information on the Memorial Day celebrations and Veterans Day celebrations, and I'm assuming the difference between the two.
Yes. It's interesting. I was thinking about Memorial Day and Veterans Day and how they're both oriented around veterans and people who've served this country. But what's interesting is that Memorial Day started up in the late 1860s, but Veterans Day was not a federal holiday until 1954. And that just seems so unusual considering that as a society we're very aware of veterans and the needs of veterans, especially their needs for their medical needs from all the PTSD and exposure to weird chemicals.
That's right. I think I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So it just seems odd that it didn't happen until 1954 that we actually had a veterans holiday, and so I started thinking about it, and it's really because society has really changed since the founding of the United States.
And of course, when you look at the history of Memorial Day, that goes back, as you said, post-Civil War, and it was Decoration Day. So it had a little bit different purpose when it was originally created as opposed to what it has turned into now.
Yes, and that too was due in part to the way society was changing in the United States in the 1860s. What's fascinating about it all is that when you look back at the 1790s, when the United States finally had a Constitution and Bill of Rights ratified and was officially the United States, at that time, they were still working on the American Revolution. It wasn't just a war of independence. It was a full social revolution. And something that the Founding Fathers were focusing on was building the United States as a republic. And there were other republics out there as well, and building it based upon democracy, which was found elsewhere as well. But what was unique was that they were trying to form an agrarian republic where everybody had their own little farm, or some people had big farms, but everybody worked on farms and lived off of their own labor. And that's why you saw such a big push from the original 13 colonies westward. But part of that was the society really valued farmers, really valued artisans, but they did not particularly value wage earners, people who worked for paychecks.
Mm-hmm.
And during the time that the Constitution was written, society, by and large, considered soldiers to be wage earners.
Okay.
And so during the debates over the Constitution, there were arguments over whether or not to even have a standing army. And during the first 5 decades of the United States, Congress kept on cutting the Army's budgets, less so of the Navy, because the Navy was responsible for protecting merchant ships. But there were actually a few instances where Congress tried to abolish the Army altogether. And the solution for protecting the United States in 1892 was the militia. And so they passed a law creating a militia, and they passed another one to actually define what the militia was. May and I believe July 1892, the Militia Acts stated that the president had the authority to call up the militia for national emergencies, and they defined the militia as all male citizens, later revised and followed laws to specify white male citizens aged 18 to 45 were a part of the national militia. And in the event of an emergency, they were expected to show up with a musket and bayonet or a rifle and enough ammunition for at least one battle.
That is really interesting. So, because the militia term, or the term militia, is in the Constitution, referenced in the Second Amendment to the Constitution, but legislatively we didn't have government legislated militias at that time?
No, it was part of the United States inheriting so much from England is that it was just one of those common law assumptions that each county would organize its own militia.
Mm-hmm.
But the United States codified it into federal law, requiring militias, requiring that all men were required to own a firearm and to be available in emergencies, because in emergencies there would be compulsory national militias and compulsory national military service.
That is interesting, because when you go back to that time, where would our enemies have come from if not over the ocean? Because most of our enemies at that time would have been, I guess, from Europe, and they would have had to sail over. So having a standing army was probably not as big a necessity, as you said, with the as opposed to the naval forces that the government had at the time to protect the commercial shipping lanes. Yeah.
Well, that was the assumption, which was really, really wrong.
Mm-hmm.
As they found out in the 1790s, trying to expand the United States into Ohio, the Native Americans there didn't really like it. And so when they tried to send militia from Kentucky and Pennsylvania over there, they lost really, really badly, and some of the worst casualty rates of any battle that the United States have ever fought, and I think it's like 80% losses in one battle.
Mm-hmm.
The enemies for the United States at that time were in Canada, the British,
right,
Florida, the Spanish, Louisiana, on the other side of the Mississippi, the French.
So they still had, those countries still had presence in North America, and then, of course, as you mentioned, the Native Americans, who were not real happy about being pushed off of their land and their territory that they had. And so I guess that would make sense. It would, if the United States did get into a conflict that required an army, without having a standing army, it would probably get beat pretty badly initially until they were trained and prepared and ready to go into battle.
Exactly. And this militia system was only tested once, and that was in the War of 1812, and it failed. It failed pretty badly. The militias had a bad habit of not acknowledging their federal status and refusing to leave their states.
Mm-hmm.
Seen especially in New York, where they didn't want to go into Canada. They didn't want to go down south towards Washington, D.C. They only wanted to defend their state.
Which kind of goes back to the federalist concepts of the founding of the country. And so the British, that's the war where they burned the White House down, right? Was the 1812?
Yes, they burned the White House. There was also a lot of fighting around Niagara Falls and going into Canada, and fighting around Detroit.
Mm-hmm.
So it was and of course New Orleans.
Right.
We can't forget New Orleans,
That's
where
right.
Andrew Jackson became famous.
That's right, and the songs that came from that as well. So, what turned the tide for the United States? If the militias, for the most part, failed, how was the United States able to win the War of 1812 and defeat the British?
Well, for starters, the United States had an excellent Navy. Smaller than the Royal Navy, but the wood that grows in the United States that they used for the ships that they built could withstand a lot more than British would. Old Ironsides, the Constitution, and other ships, those were hard to defeat.
Mm-hmm.
And the United States came up with a new system that was eventually used as the model for future wars, expanding the regular army to have a lot of short-term volunteer regiments that after the war would be disbanded. And that itself replaced the militia system.
Now, is the National Guard system that we have in place today, is that a derivative of this or as a result of these experiences that we had at that time?
It's a result, but it's a replacement in 1903.
Okay.
But even though the militia system failed in the War of 1812 and eventually died out, a lot of people still kept the attitudes held in the 1890s. They didn't particularly appreciate the notion of fighting or of serving in the military during the peacetime. And so there just wasn't a lot of recognition for veterans, especially since the attitude was that military service during a national emergency was just your civic duty, like paying your property taxes and serving on juries and voting.
Mm-hmm.
And their attitude was that someone who would take a paycheck and serve in the military during peacetime was just a mercenary.
So we can understand why Memorial Day, coming from the Civil War Decoration Day, people that gave their life in service to the country, we can understand why that started as early as it did. I take it 2 world wars is sufficient enough to change the attitudes of the country to have a Veterans Day?
Definitely. It took 2 world wars. It took military. It took actual. Well, it's complex too, because World War I, a lot of people were drafted. World War II, a lot of people were drafted. So that was simply the modern day take on the militia system, but it had major impacts on people, and likewise, doctors were finally beginning to understand that war has a major impact on people, physically, but also mentally.
Mm-hmm.
That being in the trenches of a war was really, really rough. Constant artillery, constant death. Developed PTSD that way. World War II, just nonstop fighting. They actually looked at it from a scientific perspective and calculated the number of weeks on the front line before someone would have would start to break down.
Break down mentally, yeah.
And so because of that, there was more of a push to acknowledge veterans of all wars, to acknowledge that that's an essential part of the United States. It's an essential part of democracy, and that you have to recognize everybody for their service. Before then, Armistice Day, November 11th, started in 1919 up until the end of World War II. That was just for World War I veterans.
Mm-hmm.
There was no recognition for Spanish-American War veterans. There's no recognition for Civil War veterans, for Frontier, Indian Wars veterans, or even the veterans for overseas expeditions. The Navy was very active in Indonesia before Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
The United States actually invaded Korea in 1871. So there's a lot of veterans, but it took many years for society to fully embrace the idea that veterans are just people doing an important job.
And now there is a Veterans Day, which we're glad that there is. And as you said, it started out as Armistice Day, and then evolved to where we recognize all veterans at this point in time. So, and I don't think people remember or recognize that, because as long as we can remember in current history, there's been a Veterans Day and there's been a Memorial Day. And most people probably aren't aware of the time difference between when the two holidays were created. Very interesting.
And they might not even realize that Memorial Day, likewise, for the longest time, was only a thing for the Civil War. It was widows and orphans grieving the losses of their fathers. And it took a long time for people to expand that to all soldiers who have died in the service of the country.
That's right. Well, Michael, we've got about a minute left. This is all really fascinating history, and I appreciate your knowledge in all of this. I know you've got the exhibit that's underway right now. Tell us again about that, the exhibit that folks can come and see right now.
The Fashionable Founding Fathers, Menswear of 1905. It's an exhibit focusing on what was worn, including examples of clothing and photographs of people during the time of the founding of Artesia. I wanted to focus on 1905, but as it turns out, we really don't have a lot of clothing from that specific year.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an exhibit that focuses on what was worn from 1903 to 1910.
Excellent.
With photographs, with ads from newspapers, and with illustrations from catalogs that were used in Artesia during the time.
And the museum is open what hours and days?